Personality. Personality. What makes you do the things that you do? What makes you who you are? What's your definition of personality? Who could give me their own individual definition of personality? How would one describe your personality? How would other people describe you? Or how would you describe yourself, for that matter? Yes? All right, you're quiet, right? Are you quiet because you're observant, like you just kind of like to watch, or you just don't feel the need to engage all the time? A little bit of both, right? Do you find yourself in that quietness, sort of assessing or appraising what other people are doing, or kind of analyzing them? Interesting. All right. Anybody else? So what would your definition of personality be?
My definition of
Yeah,
personality?
we could say, hey, my own personality, how would I, like, what is my definition of who I am? Things I do. Come back to you?
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else? Personality, think about it, person, right? Who you are as a person. Is it accurate? Is it off base? Right? So think of this, personality is, by definition, thoughts, feelings, and most importantly, behaviors that are consistent and show patterns over time. Right? So one can describe himself in any way they want to. But a person who's been analyzing them for a long time, say maybe your parents, will say, yeah, I disagree with that assessment. You've shown this pattern of behavior, thoughts, and feelings for a very, very long time. Thus, we will have to describe you as this in terms of personality. All right, so it has to be persistent and it has to be a pattern, right, which we could call, we'll kind of discuss more when we get into traits. So where does personality come from? Where does your personality come from? Where do you think it comes from? Yes. Okay, so we say environment, right? Remember we talked about neuroplasticity, we say, hey, environment changes your neurons, right? Wherever you are located for a persistent time, it actually changes the way your brain interacts, right? Maybe creates new neurons, or maybe even get rid of some old ones, right? And maybe suppresses them. Remember when we looked at the rat in an impoverished environment? We say impoverished environment will probably kill off neurons, right? A thriving environment will create more. It'll become more complex in terms of your brain function. All right, so environment, where else? Yes. All right, nature, nurture. So nature is, okay, mom and dad give me some genes, right, 50-50. And so I'm gonna exhibit maybe predominantly what they have. Half of dad, half of mom, mix them all together, put them in a bowl of soup. And thus is half me, right? Where you say nurture is how they push their values and what's important, what they believe is important in life onto you, and the things you should do, and this is how it should go, this is how reality is. What were you gonna say?
Say like social interaction.
Okay, so once again, social interaction, right? Which maybe we can even put under the context of environment too, right? Are you talking? Where else? Anybody can think of anything else? Yeah.
Some personal experiences.
Okay, some personal experiences, right? Maybe you experienced some trauma, maybe you experienced some great stuff that's happened and it altered your brain, thus it changed the way you are. Anything else? So think of this. Inside of you, you have a very, very, very long history. You have an evolutionary history. What does that mean? That means that you, your mom and dad, your grandparents, the people beyond them, have had their own interactions with the environment, their own conditioning, right? And nature has says this is important at this particular time, and this is not important at this particular time, right? So maybe got rid of some things and added some new things along the way. Thus, you have an evolutionary personality as well too. You don't realize that the culture of the people you come from have reinforced some of the things that you think is important or valuable or interest or motivating, right? And you say it's different from other people. We're all different in this classroom, what we're interested in, based on the culture we come from. So we say culture is extremely powerful in shaping who you are, right? Just think about that. You place everybody back into their cultural groups, you right? Oh, everybody kind of eat the same food, right? Which forms our taste profiles, right? Like, I'm used to spicy, I like spicy. Someone else from another culture says this is disgusting, right? So we say culture and our evolutionary history has an extreme, profound effect. Now, before we knew all this, as science progressed, we had the originator. And his name is Sigmund Freud, right? So Freud, who was a medical doctor, not a psychologist, because psychology wasn't really, around at that time, you would say. Freud examined people and did a lot of psychoanalysis. And Freud said basically the human personality is comprised of three things: the id, the ego, and the superego. Now he says the id is, think of going back to the reptilian brain. It's the part that wants to eat, the part that wants to sleep, it's the part that wants to procreate, it's the part that wants to do all the stuff without too much thought. It doesn't want to do too much thinking. Right? So he says the id has a pleasure principle, which means the id only wants pleasure. It doesn't care, it's not thinking rationally, it doesn't have no moral compass, it doesn't think about ethics, values, morals, any of that things. The id only wants to seek optimal pleasure in any way, shape, or form. Well, you're like, well, that's kind of reckless. Because if you only want to seek pleasure, why not, if you're mad or angry, kill people? Who cares, right? You see something you want, steal it. It's going to bring you pleasure, right? You say, that's what the id wants to do, right? Procreate without consequences, right? Who cares? You get the consequences. But beyond that, he says we have the superego. So we got the id first, then we have the superego. So the superego is more of your conscience, not your consciousness. Your conscience saying, hey, that might be a bad idea. I feel bad about doing that thing. That might be harmful to others. Let me consider other people and not just myself, right? And so your superego may be your, defined as like your morality principle, right? There's one that assesses goodness in some way, may counterbalance the id. And above that, you have just your ego. Right? So the ego is the one that makes the final decisions, choices, and judgments on things. So if you think about it simply, you say, well, the id is really almost like a devil, right? Because it just wants to do things without consequences. It does not care. Or you could say, hey, you got the devil on your left shoulder. Superego could be your angel on your right shoulder. Right in the middle, smack dab, is your head, right? That's gonna finally make a decision. So either it's gonna look to the left, look to the right, maybe put both of them together and say, hey, this makes no sense to do this particular thing. So we have id, ego, and superego, right? And beyond that, like I said, we have a lot of other ton of things, right? So we got our evolution, we have our culture, we have all sorts of additional things that came after Freud, right? So personality, we say, is a pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting, which is behaving. So we talked about psychodynamic theories, which is part of Freud's dynamic. So think about this, personality is a theory, as most things in psychology we talk about. So we say Heger's personality theory on why you are the way you are, right? You can't say definitively why you are the way you are, but we have research to back up our statement. And then we got some later psychodynamic theorists that we'll talk about, right? We've covered Maslow's before. We're talking about the hierarchy of needs and how that plays into the part of your personality, and then how your personality slightly changes over time. I, for one, don't think that personality changes that much. My theory is that past puberty, you are who you are. Right? Just big, basically just big kids. Just big people. And that actually your behavior rarely changes. It may slightly change, either due like some really bad traumatic events, or something of the sort. It has to be like some sort of major catalyst. And then we got some modern contemporary perspectives talking about trait theories and social cognitive theories. Right? All right, so we have a representation of our personality here. We say, hey, it's kind of like an iceberg, right? But unfortunately, we say all this stuff, superego and id, is actually below the waterline. So the only thing that actually sticks out at the top is the ego. Right? So it kind of makes peace, they say here, between the id and the superego. But if you want to say this is your conscious mind, in fact, that's very little, right? As I said before, we theorize that we're only using 10% of our awareness at any given time. Kind of old theory on like, oh, you only use 10% of your brain, right? That's not in the right context. It's really saying you're usually only aware of something about 10%. Other 90% is like automatic. You literally are not aware of. It's like just automatic things going on in your mind and in your body. So your id has unconscious energy, right? Which we'll talk about. Freud calls that libido. Has anyone ever heard of the term libido? So Freud calls your libido your life force. And what that means is basically your drive. So you could describe libido as your drive. It's your motivation to get things done and to do certain actions and tasks. So here, most of our personality is hidden in the unconscious mind, right? It's basically like a permanent, automatic process of things. So when you get triggered, you get emotional, you're not even aware of it, it just happens automatically, right? You're not even conscious of it. Later on, you'll maybe think about your emotions or your reaction, but initially it just happens automatically. So human behavior is dynamic interaction between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, which means there's kind of a tug of war between the two, right? The part that separates us from other animals is that prefrontal cortex, which gives us a lot of sort of consciousness and awareness. But at the same time, we still have a lot of our sort of animalistic components, right? That wants to do its own thing without really being conscious of it. And then we got psychoanalytic theory, which states that childhood sexuality and unconscious motivations influence personality. So what Freud, what always made him controversial, which made people very uncomfortable with Freud, was always the association of childhood sexuality, meaning that children also have, at some stage, may have some sort of sexual drive and motivation, some recognition. You're like, well, that could be very controversial, right? We don't want to think, we may feel uncomfortable thinking things in that way, but we also say that nature plays a big drive for us to keep the species going, so obviously that has to be a major component, right? And his psychoanalytic theory used the discovery of unconsciousness behavior and free association, which we'll get to. So talking about the id, ego, superego, his personality structure arises from the conflict between impulse and restraint and efforts to reserve this basic conflict. Which basically, we have a war going on to be impulsive, to do what we want to do without any consideration of anything else. But then we have another component where we restrain ourselves and say, hey, cause and effect. There may be effect to what we actually do, right? Maybe effect to how we actually think, right? We can maybe cause ourselves some bad things just by thinking bad things. So Freud says that children pass through a series of psychosexual stages, right, which we'll cover. The is pleasure-seeking energy focus on distinct pleasure-sensitive areas. So he calls them erogenous zones. So we'll talk about oral phase, anal phase, phallic phase, latent phase, right? In which case he's talking about those zones, right? Sensitive areas for pleasure seeking. And each stage represents challenges and conflicting tendencies. And he also covers the Oedipus complex, which means that young boys are envy of their fathers, what Freud theorizes. Thus, they want to be with their moms in some way, or may have some sort of sexual ideations about their mom when they're children. And the Electra complex, which is also controversial, right? It was just the opposite, right? The young girls tend to have what he would describe as some kind of penis envy or something, that they are subconsciously angry that they are not male, right? And thus they, at some point, may have issues with their mom or want to be extremely close to their father for some reason. All of these things make Freud very controversial, right? So people are uncomfortable with Freud, but maybe some of it may have a hint of truth in some capacity. And then identification and fixation, right? Which say how we become neurotic, fixating on things, and how do we identify ourselves within the social context. All right, so here's some classic perspectives on personality. So here's Freud's sort of take on it. He says oral phase, right? 0 to 18 months, pleasure centers on the mouth, sucking, biting, and chewing. Which means that, hey, we get pleasure out of our bottle, our mother's breast. We need that stuff for nourishment, but we also maybe chew on things, right, to calm ourselves down. It feels pleasurable for us. He also says, hey, we can actually scream and people do stuff for us. So we use our mouth to get things done, right, to satisfy pleasure in any way, shape, or form that we can get it done. So that's why he would call maybe that phase dealing with the mouth in the erogenous zone, right, in oral phase. Next, he says at a year and a half to about 3 years old, there's the anal phase. Pleasure focuses on bowel and bladder elimination, coping with demands for control, right? So you think of potty training phase. You're like, well, okay, at this point in time, you're trying to be instructed by people who are teaching you to, urinate and defecate when you feel the impulse to do so that you can control it, try to get to the bathroom before, you release, so you don't make a mess. So you're trying to have some sort of control from an anal perspective, right? And so there's the focus on that to come from some sort of sense of pleasure, right? Either by denying it, in which case they've even related some research to say that kids who do potty training too late and to have high criminality as adults, right? So basically if they haven't been sort of trained early enough, that could lead to resistance and authority, right? Later on, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50 years old. All right, so Freud next says that 3 to 6 years old is your phallic phase, right? Pleasure zone is genitals, coping with incestuous sexual feelings. The people you're around are your siblings and your parents, and at this stage, Freud says you identify that you have some sort of sexual organs. You're like, aha, what is this? You may observe it with others. Could be, if you have siblings your same age, you take baths together and play together and whatever the case may be, right? And at this stage, there could be some sort of pleasure zone with this, right? And maybe even incestuous sexual feelings, because the people you're around is typically your family. So if you're having this sort of ideations around this time, typically it might lead to something like this. All right, then he says there's latency, 6 years old to puberty, in which case you go to first grade. Now all that stuff goes to sleep. It's like this was hyper, okay, this was energetic and hyper from 0 to 6 years old. You go to first grade, go to elementary school. Now you're not thinking about that stuff, right? You're thinking about playing, right? You're just hanging out. So you have a phase of dormant sexual feelings, right? It kind of goes away for the most part. Yeah, you may like someone or be interested in a romantic way, maybe hanging out at the playground or something like that, but it's probably not sexualized. It's probably just some sort of innocent gesture. All right, beyond that, so past puberty, Freud says, beyond that, all the way up to death is the genital phase, right? Puberty on, which is a maturation of sexual interest, right? Beyond that, you say, hey, I have romantic relationships, maybe I get married, maybe I start a family, maybe I date, maybe I do whatever I want to do in that. But typically, he says everything's kind of driven, that sort of sexual interest. Right? So Freud is controversial in the sense that he says basically we got two things going on, right? According to nature. He says we have sex and aggression. Means we're all competing. And we're all competing for like sexual dominance. Right? Just like other animals. Think of like peacocks that do a dance, right, to show off to a female counterparts on why they should be chosen for mate selection, right? And then females say, hey, I am able to carry a child now 9 months, I gotta be a little bit more selective than this guy, because he can have a kid and disappear, right? He doesn't have the responsibility, right? So let me be a little bit more selective, right? Find a person who I think will stick around, maybe they're intelligent, maybe they'll pass off some good genetics, right? Maybe they're strong, maybe they're robust, maybe they have all these sorts of skills and traits. So Freud theorizes that everything basically goes from that all the motivations, whether you want to get a Ferrari or make $100,000 a year or any of the case, subconsciously, not on the conscious level, is driven by some sort of hierarchy of sexual dominance for you to be at the highest competitive peak towards your other counterparts, right? So that's Freud, and Freud is very controversial. But he also is sort of the godfather of psychology, so we can't ignore Freud, right? Freud talks about dreams and how they give a window into our unconscious behavior. So, according to Freud, so if we think about our dreams, it's like, well, what do they mean? Some people think they're meaningless, they have no substance in real life. Freud would say, no, they're actually pleasures. They're actually a window into your unconscious pleasures. They're a window into what you actually want on a subconscious level. Any questions about Freud? Who agrees with Freud? Freud says sexual aggression. You agree with him, why?
Just makes sense.
It makes sense. In what way?
It's kind of like, if you look back at your life and what you can remember, it's kind of all the same thing.
So you feel like most human motivation and drive is due towards competition or sex? Who else agrees?
I feel like in anything you do, it's competition, whether you think of it that way or not. Like, you're in a workplace environment, right? You're competing for the next spot, if that's what you want to do. You know what I mean? If that's your ambition or your goal, same thing. Or if you have like a dream, like, to play the MLB, you have to compete with other people to get there. You know, so.
Yeah. So that's Freud's theory. And so So, Freud basically summing up, Freud says that women are the gateway to sex and reproductive fruition. So in order for the human species to continue, we have 8 billion alive right now, right? Maybe, according, I think they said 100 billion people may have ever lived. That's a lot of people, right? You think about it. So if you peel back the layer and say, that's a lot of sex. It is just people born. Not to include all the other behavior of people that happen to people not being born, right? So you say, well, it's hard to ignore if you've ever traveled to see the amount of sheer human beings alive, right? You say, okay, we kind of look like ants in a way, right? And ants just want to keep going to keep the cycle going, right? So yeah, Freud says women are the gateway to sex and reproductive behavior, so therefore men are competing against one another to exude some sort of hierarchy to make this all work. Right? Now, it's controversial, and some people say I totally disagree with Freud. It doesn't matter. I mean, people make their own choices. No, free will, yada yada yada. But some other psychologists argue. A lot of biological psychologists or behavioral psychologists say we don't have free will. So basically, the thing that's going to lead to your next thought you're about to have in 3 seconds, was already formed by a few things. Your neurons, and according to your neuroplasticity, your environment that you were in, right? Your hormones from the day, whether you woke up hungry or fully satisfied, which make you crabby, angry, whatever the case, right? Maybe resistant to certain thoughts or ideas. And then going back saying, hey, your culture and your evolution has already dictated and guided your what you're going to think about, right? So there's an argument to say that there is no free will. That the thought you think is your own right now is not your own thought. It's literally an automated process just coming up from the subconscious. Yes.
Well, I kind of feel like your drives and motivations are driven by what Freud said, but who you are and what you do in terms of like on your daily life, just like habits and stuff are not driven by sex and competition. That stuff
Yeah.
is formed by interactions in your environment and stuff like that. And
So you say your immediate interactions can change all that, right? That you only interacting in the present moment.
And then if you think about it, we are creatures of nature, and like a peacock, a male peacock, has all those feathers for sexual attraction. So we're not any different than animals
Yeah.
are in terms of that type of action. So what makes us not be driven by sex and competition? You know what I mean? Same
Yeah.
thing when they compete with like the other males to try to be like the higher, animal or top, whatever leader in their den or something. Like it's the same thing. So
Yeah, so as you're saying, basically, male peacock with the feathers may be a guy in a red Ferrari pulling up
yeah.
something of the sort, right? Or basketball superstar, celebrity or something, Chris Brown or something. All right, there's, who disagrees with Freud? Who says it all sounds like a bunch of BS? No?
I don't
Tell me more.
necessarily disagree, but I think all of this is true, but kind of exaggerated, but again, extreme level.
Mhm.
So, like, I agree and disagree at the same time.
Okay, so you say Freud was onto something, but he just didn't consider a lot of other factors, right? He just took it too far. He ran with it. What were you gonna say?
I kind of doubt that I had a desire to have sex with my mom at 6 years old. That's just being totally blunt.
Yeah. So think about that. When Freud talks about that Oedipus complex, right? And he said, Freud, number one, Freud says it's unconscious behavior and through our development, right? So therefore, if it's unconscious, there may be just a sensation of an arousal of some sort. And so there's like an experimentation there that happens, but then once again, before it says, well, we have this super ego that says, these thoughts that may pass through my mind, they feel kind of bad, feel horrible. Maybe I should not jump onto my thoughts, right? Or maybe I should not act on thoughts. So even think of that too, beyond maybe Oedipus, Electra, or whatever. Think of even bad thoughts, right? You say, hey, we don't know what people think. We can't look inside people's brains. All we could typically judge people on is their behavior, right? That's about it. Can't even really judge people on their words too much. Just judge them on their behavior. With that being said, people may have some really perverted thoughts, right? But do they act on them? No, probably repress them. Freud also says controversially that if we were stranded on a desert island, all the men in this class would kill each other, right? So that whoever is the top dog can dominate. Once again, to be on that sexual hierarchy, right? So I don't know, Freud is extreme, because Freud almost puts it like a pride of lions or something like that. There's a male lion and there's a bunch of female lions, right? And the male, another one comes over, he's gonna kill him, right? So it is very extreme, which makes it controversial. Is where we are today. So a lot of things we have to consider. All right, next we got defense mechanisms. Ego's protective methods to reduce anxiety by unconsciously distorting reality. No, I'm not like that. I'm absolutely not like that. That's a complete lie. Is that true or is that false? When we say personality is patterns over time. Now, if your behavior over time has shown that pattern, you might be delusional. You might live in an alternate reality where you don't think you do the things you do. You don't behave how you behave and speak how you speak. And everybody else is wrong in the world but you. Right? It's the world against you. It's always them, never you. Which we call defense mechanism. We have to try to defend some sort of reality about ourselves. And as we get to Maslow's, we can say, hey, you know what? There's another factor on there. Right? We talk about our ideal self, right? And then our real self. The ideal is who we think we are, right? Maybe how we dress. Like, yeah, I'm trying to represent something. Right? Represent something. Representing laid back, this, some that, right? You go on Instagram, people are representing themselves in an ideal way, a perfect them. We're all trying to move to some sort of perfect us. But in reality, right now, that may be completely a lie. Right? We may have extreme vulnerabilities to things, anxiety, things people don't know about, things we're hiding from people. And as we get to Freud's counterpart, Carl Jung talks about we all wear a mask, in which case he calls it shadow, right? Carl Jung would state that we have a classroom mask on, right? And that we're protecting a fragile part of ourselves we don't want people to see. Therefore, we just show up with an avatar, a representation of what we want people to judge us on, how we want people to look at us. All right, so all sorts of interesting things, right? And which we say these are theories, these are great. All the stuff can be challenged, right? None of it is to say, hey, this is a scientific fact. No, 8 billion human beings might mean 8 billion personalities. Or maybe we're all just an experiment within ourselves, right? All right, on up here, I'm gonna shoot a notification for everybody to reach out to their groups immediately. And maybe I'll just have everyone sort of just place their email onto the announcement, right? So that way you can have all of the group members' information right there. So I'll put an announcement. All right, have a great day and I'll see you on Wednesday.